gas attack. And David Anderson took his mask off and put it on the face of the patient that they were carrying that was on the stretcher. And because of that, he was gassed. He inhaled the gas and died a rather painful death, as we understand it.
Cosmo Clark escaped the worst of gas, but had one nightmare experience that he only revealed after the war. One of his men was charged with desertion, and Cosmo tried to defend him in the subsequent court-martial.
On June the 26th, Cosmo was in the rare situation of being a prisoner's friend at a court-martial at Bully-Grenay near Lens. David Stevenson, a private with the 13th Middlesex, was charged with desertion. The case was carefully researched by Julian Putkowski in his book Shot at Dawn, who later commented, "The best efforts of the legally unqualified prisoner's friend would have been a near irrelevancy in a judicial charade which cannot have lasted longer than half an hour." David Stevenson was executed on July the 18th. The 10 men were selected from a few details left out of the line. They were nervous wrecks themselves, and 2 of them had not the nerve to fire. The last words the lads said were, "What will my mother say?"
I'm transcribing the diary of my grandfather, who I called Bapu, who I knew till the age of 9. I was about 9 when he died. I knew the diaries existed, so I got them from a cousin and started typing. And I've reached 1917. It's quite indecipherable, but it's well worth doing. I've found myself absolutely obsessed with it, because I feel the family need to know his story. He did bring the time alive with lots of ordinary details about what he's seeing that he might not have thought particularly interesting at the time, but of course 100 years later it's very, very interesting to all of us. Here's a bit of the diary. It's 16th of May 1915. Later in the morning, I walked into the town of Ypres with Stuart, our new captain. I have never seen such destruction.
Great holes, 14 feet deep and 30 feet in diameter, pit the streets, while the fronts of the houses have been rent asunder, leaving open to the eyes of all the sacred interior of many an erstwhile happy home. Not a single street and not a single house has escaped. In one house, on the outskirts, which we visited, we found everything left just as it had been when the first shells put its inhabitants to flight. Women's clothes were lying about in the bedrooms. Music was scattered round a shattered piano. The body of a large and valuable sheepdog lay in one corner of the drawing-room. Nothing living remains in Ypres, save a few half-starved dogs and cats whose disconsolate cries are the only sounds to be heard in the city.
My mother said that her father never talked about the war except to make a sort of a joke about getting wounded. He always said he stood up in a trench and demanded a bath and got shot. Of course, he wrote a great deal more than that in the diary, and I take sections and read it to her, and she says, "I never knew that. He never told me. I wish I'd known." Anyhow, this is where he gets wounded, and it's just after the Second Battle of Ypres on Whit Monday, the 31st of May. Was woken up at about 6:45 by hearing some heavy German shells bursting in the neighbourhood.
I saw Rogers, my servant, crouching close to the hedge, and shouted to ask if my bath was ready, having ordered it for 7 o'clock the night before. He laughed, I remember, and said, "Bath? You can't have no bath, sir. The Germans have blown us out of the belly." Almost at the same time I heard the noise of what I should estimate to have been an 8-inch shell approaching. I could tell that it was coming very close, and waited to hear it burst. I never did hear it, however, for something struck me a violent blow on the left temple. I remember thinking that the whole shell must have hit me on the head, since I had not heard the sound of its explosion, and that I must be dead. Simultaneously I realized that this could not be so. I recollect staggering away from the dugout through a cloud of dark shell fumes, a sickening feeling of pain in my head, and the blood blinding me and pouring in torrents over my shirt and breeches.
Ghastly though the war was, there was the odd light-hearted moment.
After his experiences in the battles in Flanders of Somme and Ypres and Passchendaele, he was then sent off with the major force at Churchill's bidding to Gallipoli, and arrived in Gallipoli, and he and 8 or 10 others set up their bell tent and managed to get hold of a keg of rum, which they buried in their tent. And unfortunately the next day the military police commandeered their tent, so never actually got to benefit from their large keg of rum, which may still be there to this day. I'm hoping to go out to Gallipoli, and who knows, may well recover it on his behalf.
Alistair Grant's grandfather was also involved in the Gallipoli campaign.
Grandfather got wounded. He was struck in the head by a bullet, clearly not fatally, otherwise I wouldn't be here, and got evacuated to Royal Naval Hospital B, which is in Malta, just opposite Valletta, very fine sort of colonial building. And he found he was in a particular ward called Rose Cottage. Now, any of you with a naval background would know that Rose Cottage was a euphemism for the VD ward, those who had caught the clap. He was not amused by this, and demanded an interview with the surgeon captain running the hospital. This takes a bit of nerve, because after all, he was, 22 years at that time, 22 years old, but he demanded to be moved to a proper ward, and not one with the slur of having caught the clap from some prostitute down the gut, which was the sort of main area in Valletta. Lots of photographs here. It was a very difficult and unpleasant time. He said the Turks were much harder to fight than the Germans. Very ferocious fighters. And they had to improvise. This picture here shows a catapult. They ran short of grenades, and one of the things they did was to make improvised explosive devices, sounds like Afghanistan. They put explosives into baked bean tins or other tins, and literally would catapult them a relatively short distance. We're probably talking about 30 or 40 yards into the Turkish trenches.
Grandpa won a medal, didn't he, for something special? What do you know what the story is there?
The story is that there was a lull in the fighting, and early in the morning the padre, or one of them, went in the buff to have a swim in the river. And the fighting started up again, and they must have all realised what he was doing. And so my father went across and put him on, I think, a sort of fireman's lift and brought him back to where the front line was at the time. And later in time, he got this medal for bravery in the field. It's the military medal. Right. The blue, white and red stripe one is the military medal. He was just an ordinary trooper, as it were, right. Not an officer, and so for the ordinary people it's the medal and not the cross.
Only 2 wounds that he actually suffered. One was to scratch his knee on some barbed wire, and the second was somebody hit him over the head with a tankard in a bar. Very, very fortunate to come away virtually unscathed. During my father's time in Flanders, and I think it was on the Somme, my father was awarded the Military Cross, which we have here. How he came to win that award is quite remarkable, in that he was on a patrol across no man's land towards the enemy lines, and his particular task was to try and take a pillbox full of German machine gunners. And this he eventually managed to get up close to it, and entering with his Webley six-shooter, gained a surrender from 6 Germans who didn't know his revolver was jammed with mud. And he took the prisoners back to the Allied lines, and consequently he was awarded his military cross. And this photograph of my father, taken in London with an aunt and uncle, on his way to Buckingham Palace in 1919 for the award of his military cross. And interestingly enough, in 2009, I was at the palace 90 years later after my father for an award of an MBE, and very proud to be wearing his medals.
My grandfather was no great lover of the top brass. When Lord Kitchener died in June 1916, he was drowned. The nation went into hysterical mourning, rather like for Lady Di. My grandfather didn't think much of him. Here's what he wrote about it.
The death of Kitchener has had an immense effect on the multitude, for whom he is a fetish. As a matter of fact, I do not think that his death will affect the conduct of the war at all, in adverse sense. Wild rumours that he had been saved were flying all over London and the provinces during the afternoon and evening. The Lord Mayor had made a speech earlier in the afternoon in which he had said that Lord Kitchener was not really dead because he lived on in our memories. Some idiot thereupon went about saying that Kitchener was not dead, and in an hour the news was all over London. 30th of June 1916. The Kitchener Memorial Service was held at St. Paul's today. I could not obtain a ticket. Sergeant Jeremiah went, and when I asked him what he thought of it, "It was wonderful, sir. Generals was as common as flies." So they are. England is suffering from a perfect plague of generals, doddering old idiots who are consuming her substance. Not one single man of note has arisen in the country since the war. Kitchener has passed away, there was a moment's sensation, and now, after a week, everything goes on as before. So it would be with all our other public men. None of them is essential.
The armistice was declared on November the 11th, 1918.
So you'd be about 10 at the end of the war.
I suppose they would.
Yes. So probably there may have been some flag waving at the end of the war, but people happy? Do you think people were? They were very happy?
Very happy.
Do you remember any particular celebrations, how you felt?
Yes, great celebrations with balloons and things when they end the war.
I love parties.
You love parties?
But once the street parties and the jubilation was over, it was clear that the war had left an indelible mark.
His war sort of did have an effect on him because he had mustard gas.
Oh.
And that's why he lost all his teeth. He had to have replacement false teeth.
What, at 18?
No, but it happened
right.
that gradually they deteriorated until he was about 30, 31. And he had
full set of dentures.
Full set because of that gassing. Yes.
Nonetheless, Sidney Bolland was still sound in body and mind, apart from his teeth, and picked up where he'd left off, playing cricket at Lord's.
The retired officers were challenged by a team led by Jack Hobbs at Lord's in 1919. And so there's a picture here, it's the fielding side, which is Grandpa is in, my father's in. That's the one that is recorded in the Wisdom, which is the cricketer's almanac.
Many soldiers found it hard to adjust to returning home, and this in turn made it hard for the family, as in the case of the Grunwalds.
When my grandfather George came back, knocked on the door and was welcomed by my grandmother, and they kissed each other. My father attacked my grandfather because he didn't recognise the man who was kissing his mother. My grandfather was very shell-shocked, and my father used to tell me that he would fall asleep in front of the fire, and sometimes the fire would crack. There would be a crackle, some bit of stone had got in with the coal, and then he would leap from his chair and grab the poker and just flail around the room thinking that he was being attacked again. I think he did probably attack my grandmother, or maybe only when she was trying to restrain him, but my father, who was still a very young boy at that stage, felt a great need to protect his mother, and I think it was not an easy childhood. I think he didn't really understand his father, and many years later he told me that he had hated his father. He just didn't understand it, and in my father's later years, he felt guilty that he had felt that way. He hadn't understood well enough what had gone on in the war, as indeed nobody really understood, I think, at the time. It's only come out later.
Conway Berners-Lee's father had lived through the war, but never managed to throw off the psychological stress.
People back in England had no idea what this was all about. I think his career does illustrate the awfulness and stupidity of war, because he certainly lost. And when it came to actually running the business, taking over this iron foundry in Wednesbury, which is a very black country part of Birmingham, from my grandfather, he really wasn't the man for that job at that stage. And